I was 25 years old when my company chose me to represent them on a business trip that felt far bigger than anything I had ever been trusted with before. Back home, I had always been the youngest in the office, the one eager to prove himself, the one who stayed late and volunteered for every difficult task. When the offer came to fly across the ocean to meet with an Arab sheikh about a deal that could open enormous opportunities for us, I didn't hesitate. But the moment I stepped onto the plane, nerves began to swirl in my stomach. I was young, ambitious. But what if I wasn't enough? What if I said the wrong thing or embarrassed myself in front of someone with such influence? The first thing that struck me when I landed was the air. It carried a kind of dry heat I had never felt before, heavy but alive with a foreign rhythm. The city spread out like something pulled from a dream. Gleaming towers, ancient arches, streets lined with palms and lights. My driver, a man in crisp white robes, spoke little English but greeted me with a smile and a hand over his heart, a gesture that somehow felt warmer than any words. I sat back in the car, watching the desert roll in the distance, while my mind kept circling around the same thought. I had stepped into a world far from my own, and I had no idea how it would change me. The Sheikh's residence was unlike anything I had ever seen. The gates rose high and opened slowly, revealing a courtyard lit with golden lanterns. Marble gleamed beneath my shoes as I was led inside, past fountains that whispered, past guards who bowed slightly but watched every move. The air smelled faintly of oud, rich and smoky. Everything whispered of power, of wealth that didn't need to be shown off, because it was woven into the very stones of the place. And then I met him. The sheikh stood at the far end of the hall, his posture straight, his eyes sharp, his robe falling in flawless folds. For a moment, his presence knocked the breath out of me. There was something commanding about him, as if the room bent slightly toward his will. Yet when he stepped forward, he greeted me with a smile that softened the edges of his authority. His hand was warm when he shook mine, and his voice carried a deep, steady calm. "Welcome," he said. "I trust your journey was smooth?" I managed a nod, hoping my nerves didn't show. "Yes. Thank you for receiving me. It's an honor to be here." He studied me for a moment, not unkindly, but with an intensity that made me feel as though he could see more than I was saying. Then, with a slight nod, he gestured for me to follow. Our first conversations were cautious, each of us weighing the other. He spoke of the market, of future prospects, of the way to tradition and the hunger for growth. I did my best to answer with confidence, though my heart thudded in my chest. Yet the longer we talked, the more I felt the tension shift. He was intelligent, precise, but not unapproachable. He asked questions that showed he was listening, that he valued my perspective even though I was younger, less experienced. I couldn't help but notice the way his words carried double meanings, as though layers of thought were hidden beneath them. He had a mystery about him, a man of enormous power who somehow seemed lonely beneath it. When he looked at me across the long, polished table, his eyes lingered just a little longer than necessary, and I couldn't quite tell if it was scrutiny or curiosity. That first evening ended with polite handshakes and promises to meet again the next day. I was led my room, more like a palace chamber than a hotel suite, where I stood at the window, staring out at the desert glowing under the moonlight. My body was tired, but my mind buzzed with questions. Who was this man, really, beyond the robes and the authority? Why did I feel such a strange pull toward him, even after only a few hours? I had come here for business, but a part of me sensed that something deeper was beginning, something I couldn't yet name. The next few days unfolded like a rhythm I slowly began to understand. Every morning, I was led into a meeting hall where long wooden tables were set with documents, tea, and the faint scent of incense. The sheikh always entered with quiet authority, his robes flowing, his voice steady. Negotiations began promptly, with translators hovering nearby though we rarely needed them. His English was excellent, polished and deliberate, while my attempt at Arabic brought only amused smiles. At first, I struggled with the cultural nuances. I was used to the fast pace of American meetings, where efficiency was everything. Here, there was patience, pauses, an expectation that business was not just numbers on a page, but a bond of trust between men. Before each session, the sheikh would offer me thick Arabic coffee in small cups, its bitterness startling at first, and dates that melted like caramel on my tongue. Only then, after these rituals, will we begin to talk numbers, logistics, futures. I began to learn that in his world, hospitality was not separate from business. It was part of it. Meals stretched into hours. The Sheikh would host me in vast dining rooms where silver platters of lamb, saffron rice, fresh bread, and bowls of hummus were spread like feasts for kings. He insisted I eat, his hand gesturing warmly for me to take more, to taste everything. He told me stories about the traditions of his people, about how every guest was sacred, every deal sealed not just with ink, but with shared bread and salt. At first, I was cautious, measuring my words, afraid to make a mistake. But the Sheikh had a way of disarming me. His laughter, when it came, was deep and genuine, breaking through formality like sunlight through a curtain. He would ask about my home, my family, my life in America. And when I spoke, he listened, truly listened, as though every detail mattered. Day by day, the tension of our negotiations softened. Trust began to grow like a bridge between us. I could see it in the way he would lean slightly closer when I explained a detail, in the nod of approval when I spoke with conviction. Once, when I admitted I was nervous about representing my company alone, he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and said, "Strength is not in age or years, but in sincerity. You carry that." The word stayed with me long after. By the end of the 5th day, the contract was finalized. The papers lay signed between us, stamped with the weight of two worlds coming together. My company would be thrilled. The terms were favorable, the partnership promising. Yet as I sat across from the Sheikh, I realized my sense of accomplishment wasn't only about business. Something had shifted. I had expected to feel relief, pride, maybe exhaustion. Instead, I found myself studying him. The quiet way he set down his pen, the glint of satisfaction in his eyes, the calm that settled over him once the formalities were complete. There was more to this man than power and wealth. He had shown me generosity, patience, and a kind of kindness that felt personal, directed not at the company I represented, but at me, the young man sitting across from him. That evening, as we shared another meal, the atmosphere felt different. The pressure of negotiation was gone, replaced by something looser, more intimate. He asked me about my dreams beyond work, about what I wanted for myself, not just for my career. I hesitated, caught off guard. No one had asked me that in a long time. I admitted that sometimes I felt lost, caught between ambition and loneliness. He nodded slowly, as though he understood more than I had said aloud. "Even kings can feel alone," he murmured, his eyes distant for a moment. Then he turned back to me with a small smile, as if brushing away the weight of his own words. As the night stretched on, I found myself curious, not about his fortune or his influence, but about the man behind it all. Who was he when the guards weren't watching, when the world wasn't demanding his command? The mystery lingered in my mind as I returned to my room, the echo of his words and the warmth of his presence refusing to leave me. I had come here for business. But already, I could feel something stirring, something that had little to do with contracts or signatures. It became a kind of ritual after that. Each evening, once the business of the day was behind us, the Sheikh would invite me to join him somewhere quieter, away from the halls and meeting tables. Sometimes it was a private terrace that overlooked the city, where the lights glittered like scattered jewels against the darkness. Other nights, it was a courtyard with a fountain that whispered softly under the moon. And once, he even took me to a tent pitched at the edge of the desert, lanterns glowing inside, the stars spread endlessly overhead. He would pour drinks, rich, dark whiskey one night, delicate tea the next, and gesture for me to sit beside him. At first, I thought of these evenings as mere hospitality, part of the graciousness he had shown since my arrival. But it didn't take long to realize there was something else in them, something that felt more personal, as though he was letting me glimpse the man behind the title. We talked for hours. He asked about my life in America, about the noise of the cities, about the cold winters I described. I told him about my childhood, about my parents who never quite understood why I pushed myself so hard, about my restless drive to succeed. And he listened, not with the polite attention of a host, but with focus that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. In turn, he began to share pieces of his own life. At first, They were small details: his love for horses, his fondness for poetry, his memory of riding into the desert as a boy with his father. But gradually, the stories deepened. He told me about the weight of leadership, about how every decision he made rippled through countless lives. He admitted that his wealth and power often built walls rather than bridges, that people bowed to him but rarely looked at him as a man. Loneliness, he said one night, his eyes fixed on the horizon, does not care about riches. Sometimes the more you have, the more you are alone. The honesty in his voice startled me. It wasn't something I had expected from him. A man so untouchable, so admired, confessing to emptiness. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. But then as I looked at him, at the faint weariness in his eyes, I felt something stir inside me. A recognition, maybe, or a kind of kinship. I told him about the pressure I carried, how being chosen to represent my company had felt both like an honor and a burden. I confessed that sometimes I didn't know who I was outside of my work, that I had spent so long proving myself that I had forgotten how to simply be. My voice cracked when I admitted that I often felt like a stranger in my own life, chasing something I couldn't quite define. He turned to me then, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if I had said too much, if I had overstepped by showing such vulnerability. But then he nodded slowly as if he understood. Perhaps that is why we find comfort in each other's company, he said quietly. That night, I almost told him the truth I had carried in silence for years, that I was gay, that I had hidden it from nearly everyone in my world for fear of judgment or rejection. The words sat heavy on my tongue, but I swallowed them back. I wasn't ready yet. Still, the urge to confide in him was strong, stronger than it had ever been with anyone else. We laughed, too. Not every night was solemn. Some evenings, after a few glasses, he would tell me humorous stories about his youth, about mischief with cousins or the time he fell from a horse and tried to hide it from his father. I teased him gently about his stern expression during our first meeting, and he chuckled, shaking his head. I had to test you, he said, but you pass. There was an ease between us that grew with each passing evening. A glance held a little longer, a smile that lingered. It wasn't anything spoken aloud, but it was there, in the air between us, in the way the silences felt comfortable rather than heavy. One night, as we sat outside the tent at the edge of the desert, the stars above us brighter than I had ever seen, the air cool against my skin, I felt something shift. He leaned back, his robe brushing against mine, and for a moment, our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was alive, charged with something unspoken. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The sharp line of his jaw, the calm strength in his posture, the flicker of softness in his eyes when he turned to meet my gaze. And in that moment, I realized with startling clarity that my curiosity about him was no longer just professional. I was drawn to him. It frightened me, and yet it thrilled me, because in his company, beneath the desert stars, I felt less like a stranger in my own skin. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. There was one night that felt unlike any of the others, though at first it began the same way. We sat together on the terrace, a light breeze stirring the curtains that hung from the arches, the city stretching far below like a sea of stars. A bottle of whiskey stood between us, the glasses half-filled, the silence longer than usual. Normally, our conversation slipped easily from one story to another, from laughter to thoughtfulness. But that night, there was a tension I couldn't quite name. He seemed restless, his gaze turning often toward the horizon, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass. I waited, unsure if I should speak, sensing he was carrying something heavier than words. When he finally did, his voice was low, almost hesitant. "Do you ever feel," he asked, not looking at me, "that the world only allows you to show half of yourself?" The question startled me. I turned toward him, but his eyes remained fixed on the distance. "What do you mean?" I asked softly. He was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching thin between us. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, "I have lived my life in a cage of expectation. Wealth, duty, power, they are chains disguised as honors. People see me, but they do not see me. They bow, they obey, they flatter. But if they knew the truth of me, He paused, his hand tightening around his glass. If they knew who I truly am, they would turn away. Something in his voice, raw, unguarded, made my chest tighten. My heart began to beat faster, though I wasn't sure why. Finally, he turned his gaze to me. His eyes were sharp, but beneath the sharpness was something almost fragile. I am a lover of men, he said simply, and in my world, that truth must remain hidden. The words landed like a spark striking dry earth. For a moment, I just stared at him, my mind scrambling, my breath caught in my throat. I had never expected him to say such a thing. Not this man who carried himself with such strength and certainty. And yet, hearing it, I felt an almost dizzying rush of recognition, of relief. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly. You don't have to be alone in that, I said, my voice unsteady, because I am too. He blinked, his expression shifting, the tension in his features easing into something I had never seen before. Surprise, then something close to wonder. You? I nodded. My chest felt tight, but it was a good tightness, like something long buried was finally breaking free. I've hidden it for years. From my colleagues, my family, even my friends. I was afraid that if they knew, I would lose everything I had worked for. I thought I was safe for pretending, but it left me feeling. I hesitated, searching for the word. Alone. His eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence now was different, no longer tense, but heavy with the weight of understanding. It was as if a wall that had stood between us had suddenly crumbled, leaving nothing but open ground. I have never spoken aloud like this, he admitted, his voice low. Not to anyone, not in all my years. Me neither, I whispered. Something in his face shifted again, a quiet relief that mirrored my own. He reached out, almost hesitantly, and laid his hand on my shoulder. The touch was steady, warm, grounding me. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw no judgment, no fear, only acceptance, perhaps even gratitude. For a long while we sat like that, his hand on my shoulder, my eyes locked on his. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. But in that stillness, in that simple touch, more was spoken than words could ever say. We had both carried our truths in silence, weighed down by loneliness. And now, here we were, not alone anymore. I felt a smile tug at my lips, small but real. He noticed, and the corner of his mouth curved upward as well. A faint laugh escaped him, quiet and almost disbelieving. What strange fortune, he murmured, to find someone who understands, when I had long stopped hoping for it. I swallowed hard. My chest wore with something that felt dangerously close to joy. Maybe it isn't fortune, I said. Maybe it's just meant to be. His fingers pressed gently against my shoulder, a subtle answer, a silent agreement. That night, as the stars shimmered above us and the desert wind swept softly through the terrace, I knew something irreversible had shifted between us. We were no longer just business partners, no longer just host and guest. We had become something else. Two men who had seen each other's hidden selves and found comfort instead of rejection. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. After that night, nothing between us was quite the same. The contract had been signed, the business complete, but the business was no longer what tied me to him. The air between us carried a new charge, something softer, something far more personal. We still spoke of work when required, but the words felt secondary, almost unnecessary compared to the quiet connection that had bloomed in the spaces between them. The Sheikh began to show me corners of his life I hadn't expected to see. In the mornings, instead of calling me to the formal halls, he would invite me to walk with him through the gardens that sprawled behind his residence. They were lush and carefully tended, with roses and jasmine filling the air with fragrance. He moved through them with a kind of ease, pointing out certain plants with stories of how his mother once cared for them, or how as a boy he used to sneak away here to escape his tutors. It was in those walks that I first heard his laughter unguarded, deep and warm, when I told him a clumsy story about getting lost in my own office building on my first day of work. At times, our shoulders brushed as we walked side by side along the gravel paths. He didn't step away, and neither did I. That simple closeness was enough to send ripples through me, an awareness that hummed beneath my skin. One afternoon, he took me beyond the palace walls to his stables. The horses were magnificent, tall, sleek, their coats gleaming like polished stone. He introduced them to me as though they were old friends, stroking their necks, speaking to them in Arabic. When I hesitated, he took my hand gently, guiding it toward one of the horse's manes. His hand lingered over mine longer than necessary, steadying me, grounding me. "You see," he said with a small smile, "they know when you are sincere. They will trust you if you trust them." The words carried more weight than just about horses, and we both knew it. Another evening. He invited me to ride out with him into the desert. We drove for what felt like miles until the city lights faded behind us and the endless sand stretched in every direction. A small camp had been prepared, lanterns glowing, rugs laid across the ground. We sat together, sipping tea brewed over fire, the desert night surrounding us with silence, so vast it made the world feel both endless and intimate at once. "This place reminds me," he said quietly, "that all our empires and palaces are only temporary. Here, there's only the sand, the stars, and the truth of who we are." I looked at him then, the firelight flickering across his face, and felt something inside me tighten. I wanted to reach for him, to let my hand rest against his, to close the distance that had been shrinking little by little every day. But I held back, unsure, caught between fear and desire. It was he who bridged it first. One night, as we sat on the terrace after dinner, the city quiet below us, he leaned just slightly closer when I spoke, his eyes fixed on mine with intensity that made my heart race. I stopped mid-sentence, unable to remember what I had been saying. The silence stretched, but this time it was not heavy. It was electric. He raised a hand, hesitated, and then let it rest gently against my cheek. My breath caught. The warmth of his palm was steady, reassuring, as if he were asking without words, "Is this what you want too?" I answered without speaking. I leaned forward, closing the final space between us. Our lips met softly, not with urgency, but with a tenderness that made my chest ache. It was not a kiss of conquest or desperation, but one of recognition, of quiet relief. The world seemed to fall away until there was only the two of us, suspended in that moment beneath the endless sky. When we finally pulled back, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability, a rawness, and perhaps even a hint of fear, as though he had given me a piece of himself no one else had ever touched. "I should not have," he began, his voice low, uncertain. "Yes," I whispered, cutting him off gently. "You should." We both laughed softly, then, the tension easing, and he let his forehead rest lightly against mine. From that night on, the gestures between us carried a new weight. A brush of his hand against mine at the table, the way he walked slightly closer to me in the gardens, his arm sometimes grazing mine, the protective way he guided me through a crowded hallway, his palm briefly at the small of my back. They were small things, unnoticed by others, but to me they meant everything. Days slipped by faster than I expected. The 5 days I was supposed to spend in his world had already stretched beyond, and I found myself dreading the thought of leaving. Each morning I woke with the thought that soon this would end, and each night I fell asleep knowing I didn't want it to. One evening, as we stood together on the terrace, the city lights glowing faintly below us, I finally admitted it. "I was supposed to leave days ago," I said, "but I can't bring myself to go." He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. For a heartbeat, I thought he might remind me of my duty, tell me I must return the life I had left behind. Instead, he reached for my hand, his fingers curling around mine with quiet certainty. "Then stay," he said simply. And in that moment, I knew I would. The decision to stay did not come with fanfare or long deliberation. It slipped into place quietly, like something that had already been decided in my heart long before my lips spoke the words. I was supposed to be gone after 5 days. Yet as one day bled into another, I found myself inventing reasons to remain, updates to send to my company, adjustments to the contract, matters I claimed still needed my oversight. But the truth was simple. I couldn't bear to leave him. The Sheikh made no protest. If anything, he seemed relieved. From that moment, the pace of our days shifted. No longer bound by negotiation or formality, we lived in a rhythm entirely our own. Mornings began with shared breakfast in a sunlit courtyard, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and cardamom. He would sit across from me, his robe loose, his expression softened from a man of authority I had first met. Sometimes he would tease me about the way I always reached for strongest coffee, claiming Americans had no patience for subtlety. I'd tease him in return, and he would laugh, that deep, warm laugh that never failed to light something inside me. Our afternoons were often spent exploring. He showed me places that tourists never saw, old mosques where the air smelled faintly of stone and history, bustling markets where merchants called out their wares, hidden courtyards filled with fountains and quiet shadows. More than once, I caught people bowing to him, their eyes lowered in respect, and I realized again just how different our world were. Yet, when we were alone, walking side by side, he was simply himself. He brought me to the desert more than once. We would ride horses until the sun dipped low, then sit together by the fire while the stars unfolded overhead. In those moments, words often felt unnecessary. The silence between us was not empty but full, like the desert itself, vast, alive, endless. Evenings became our most treasured time. Sometimes it was a grand dinner in the palace, the two of us at the head of a table lined with dishes I could barely pronounce. Other times, it was just the two of us in his private quarters, a simple meal, a bottle of wine, conversation that stretched into the early hours of morning. Those were the nights when honesty came easiest. We spoke of our past, of the paths that had brought us here. He told me of the sacrifices he had made, of the parts of himself he had buried to carry the weight of his role. I confessed my fears, that my life back home fell hollow, that I didn't know if I was living for myself or for the expectations of others. "You give too much of yourself to people who will never see you," he said once, his voice gentle but firm. "Here, you do not have to prove anything. You are enough as you are." Those words stayed with me. Slowly, I felt my own confidence grow, as though his belief in me was something I could wear like armor. And in turn, I saw him soften in ways I hadn't thought possible. The sternness that once defined him gave way to smiles, to playful banter, to quiet touches that lingered. It was as though he, too, had been waiting for someone with whom he could finally exhale. Our relationship deepened with each passing night. What began as a tender kiss grew into something fuller, richer, more consuming. There were nights when passion overtook us, when the boundaries we had held for so long finally fell away. But even in the most intimate moments, there was never haste or hunger alone. It was respect, tenderness, the kind of closeness that made me feel cherished rather than consumed. His touch was steady, reverent, and when he held me, I felt safe in a way I had never known. Yet with all the joy, there was also conflict inside me. My life in America hovered at the edges of my thoughts, emails waiting, responsibilities ignored, the certainty that eventually questions would come. What excuse could I give for staying longer than planned? What future could I build with a man whose world was so different from mine? At times, I lay awake beside him, the desert night quiet around us, wrestling with the pull of two lives. One was familiar, expected, secure. The other was uncertain, risky, and yet so alive it made the thought of going back unbearable. He sensed it, of course. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset from his balcony, he said quietly, "You are thinking of leaving." The word struck me like a blow. I turned to him quickly. "I don't want to," I said, the truth spilling out before I could temper it. "Every time I think of going back, it feels wrong. But I don't know how this fits, how I fit here." He regarded me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, gently, he reached for my hand. "Perhaps it is not about fitting into the world as it is," he said. "Perhaps it is about creating a world where you belong." Something in me broke open at those words. I realized then that what we had built in those weeks was not just attraction, not just comfort. It was love, real, undeniable love. It had crept in quietly, day by day, until suddenly it filled every corner of my being. I stayed. 1 week became 2, then 3, then 4. My company sent emails I ignored, my phone buzzing with unanswered calls. The world I left behind grew dimmer with each passing day, replaced by this one, a world of desert skies, of laughter in gardens, of warmth shared across a table, of nights spent in arms that felt like home. By the time a month had passed, I could no longer imagine measuring my life in contracts or promotions. I measured in the way he smiled when he saw me in the mornings, in the sound of his laughter echoing in the courtyard, in the quiet way he held my hand when no one else was watching. I had come here a stranger, a young man with everything to prove. I had found instead something I hadn't even known I was searching for, a love that made all the striving and loneliness fade into insignificance. And though I knew the future would bring its challenges, 2 different worlds, 2 lives stitched together by choice rather than ease, I also knew one thing with certainty. I would rather face those challenges with him than live a safe and empty life without him. The days slipped through my fingers like fine desert sand, and before I knew it, the calendar reminded me of what I had once believed would be my departure. I would wake in the mornings with sunlight pouring through the curtains of the Sheikh's palace, his laughter or quiet words lingering in my ears from a night before, and for the first time in my life, I dreaded the idea of going home. What was home now, anyway? The apartment back in the States, the sterile office, the endless rush of deadlines? Or was home here, in the warmth of the desert air, in the stillness of his gaze, in the steady rhythm of a man who had welcomed me into a world I never imagined for myself? One evening, as we sat together in the courtyard beneath a sky embroidered with stars, I felt the weight of it all pressing gently on me. My heart was full, yet uneasy. The Sheikh must have felt it too, because his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, his expression softer, less guarded than I had ever seen. "You know," he began, his voice low, carrying that rich gravity I had grown to love, "before you came, my life was quiet, too quiet. People surrounded me every day, business partners, servants, advisors, but no one ever truly saw me. You did. Somehow, in just a month, you changed that." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. His words were not the polished diplomacy of a leader. They were raw, unarmored. "And you changed me," I whispered back. "I thought I was coming here for work, to prove myself to my company. But instead, I found something I wasn't even looking for. I found you." For a moment, silence wrapped around us, but it wasn't heavy. It was alive, pulsing, carrying everything we didn't need to say. He reached across the small table and took my hand in his touch firm yet gentle, a promise in itself. "I don't want this to end," he said, his dark eyes glimmering with sincerity. "I know our worlds are different. I know it won't be easy. But I don't want you to think this was just a passing moment in the desert." I squeezed his hand, my chest tightening with emotion. "It doesn't feel like a moment. It feels like a beginning. And if you'll have me, I want more beginnings with you. Wherever, however, we'll figure it out." He smiled then, a rare smile that reached his eyes and softened every line of his face. "Then we'll make a promise," he said. "No matter how far the distance, no matter how heavy the responsibilities, we will return to each other, again and again." I leaned closer, my forehead brushing against his, the desert breeze cool around us. "It's a promise," I breathed. In that instant, the uncertainty of tomorrow seemed less frightening. There would be flights back and forth, messages sent across time zones, the ache of distance, yes. But there would also be reunion, longing turned to joy, and the knowledge that somewhere in the vastness of this world, I belonged to someone and he belonged to me. As the night deepened, I imagined a future we had just dared to dream aloud. Visits in secret gardens, quiet mornings over coffee, stolen evenings by the fire, perhaps someday even more. And though the end of my stay drew near, I didn't feel the weight of farewell. I felt the strength of something that would last, something neither borders nor silence could erase. I looked into his eyes one last time that night, and in them I saw not an ending but a horizon, wide, endless, and waiting for us.